Welcome, Stefanie, to the podcast.
So great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure and an honor. Let's start with, first, an introduction of who you are. So what do you think is important for the audience to know about you?
Okay, sure, yes. Well, my education is all from MIT, undergraduate, and 4 degrees, bachelor's, master's, EE degree, and PhD. Undergraduate in biology, and the higher degrees were in electrical engineering and computer science. I have a kind of eclectic background. Most of my career, all of my career, was at MIT. I never left MIT, so I love it. And I'm now a senior research scientist, which is the highest rank on the research staff at MIT. And most of my work involved developing human-computer interaction, developing skills of the computer to be able to communicate with people using natural speech, precursors to Amazon Echo and Siri on the iPhone. We were the very early pioneers in that space, which was exciting. Wow. But I can see AI is actually going in an interesting direction right now that is a little bit uncomfortable. So we'll see where all that leads. But it's quite disruptive. I think it's going to be a disruptive technology. Anyway, about 2006, 2007, I was watching the autism rates go up year by year in the United States, and I was frustrated that most of the research dollars were going towards genetics, thinking that it was a genetic disease. And I will admit there's a genetic component to it. Some people have certain genes that are defective, which gives them higher risk. But it had to be something in the environment that was causing autism, I felt. And I was determined to figure out what it was. Unfortunately, my funder was willing to switch me over to a different program. I had been developing systems to help people learn a foreign language, specifically English-speaking people learn Chinese through dialogue with the computer, which was I loved it. It was a fun project. It's a feel-good kind of thing to be doing. And that field has really done well, too. I think it's an exciting area to allow the computer to help you practice your speaking without the embarrassment of dealing with a human. And that can help you learn words and everything, and even learn how to write in Chinese. So that was really fun. I was really enjoying it. But then I basically dropped it and switched over to researching environmental chemicals and looking for what might be causing the autism epidemic initially. And it eventually branched out into what's causing all of us to be so sick these days, because it's much more than autism, as I realized. As I looked, I realized, oh my God, all these things. And of course, I saw obesity go up. It's been dramatic in the last 20, 30 years. When I was a child, you rarely saw anybody that weighed over 200 pounds. And now it's just very common. Obesity and autism are both, I think, connected to the same problem, which is glyphosate. And then, of course, I wrote my book. This is my book, Toxic Legacy, How the Weed Killer of Glyphosate is Destroying Our Health and the Environment. And that was the culmination of 10 years of research on glyphosate. So I kind of dropped everything once I learned about glyphosate. I started looking in 2007, and I heard a presentation by Professor Don Huber, originally from Purdue. He's now over 80 years old and still active, going all around the world talking about glyphosate. And so I didn't know what glyphosate was when I walked in the room. 2012, he gave a 2-hour presentation. I walked away convinced that I had found my answer. It was that good, because I was studying autism all those years, 5 years of studying autism. I understood a lot about what the disease was. I realized it's a very complex disease with really the gut playing a central role in the problems. Right. So I was looking for something that was poisoning the gut. And what better than something in the food, right? And glyphosate's all over the food supply. So, and then he talked about what glyphosate does, and it fit well with what autism is as far as the symptoms. It just all matched up like hand in glove. I was so impressed and so convinced that I just went away and started focusing on glyphosate after that.
You've done so many things. It's incredible. Before we get into the glyphosate topic, does your brain ever switch off, or is it just like a train going on? And I got things to do.
I know. I think I have an unusual brain. It just wants exercise all the time. I love puzzles. I love to solve puzzles. If I'm solving a puzzle, I'm so happy. Not just like a biology puzzle, which is of course huge, but even a jigsaw puzzle or a Sudoku puzzle. I take the really hard Sudoku puzzles. I love them. So my brain just likes to solve puzzles, I think, is really what separates me. And I love biology. I'm so fascinated with biology. Just absolutely mesmerized by it, I would say. So it's wonderful. I mean, it's sad that the world is in such a crisis right now, which I believe. And I think the pharmaceutical industry is completely on the wrong track. And this, the food is on the wrong track. I mean, there's a lot wrong with our country, with our Earth, really, with the humans right now. We need to do a whole reset of a whole bunch of things. And so that gives it an urgency. So right now, I'm actually the happiest I've ever been in my job in terms of my work so well dovetails with something that I think is really important. And so I feel very, I love doing it, and at the same time I feel like I'm doing something important. So it's really, really wonderful. And I get to work on it, every moment I get, I work on it. I don't do much else besides, studying biology, basically, and writing papers.
Well, I think when you found that, you're doing the right thing. So let's start with the glyphosate, just to bring in every level of whoever's listening to this. What is glyphosate?
Right. So many people don't know the word glyphosate probably, but if I tell you Roundup, I think that's a much more familiar term, and that's probably the most common herbicide formulation that has glyphosate in it. There's many other things as well, but that one's the one that's known best for the residential communities. People use it to kill the dandelions on their yard or to clear the weeds, their walkway. It's considered to be extremely safe to humans and very effective, and so people love it for that reason. And it's, of course, what happened really in the late 1990s was that they were able to develop this GMO technology where they could insert a bacterial gene into the genome of a plant, which provided protection against glyphosate. And basically that was a working version of the enzyme that the plant makes, a different version of that enzyme the plant makes that gets killed by glyphosate. And that enzyme is super, super critical to the plant. So all plants die when they're exposed to glyphosate, except for those that have had this engineered, technology to insert that bacterial gene. A very clever technology. They're really excited about it. And their belief was that glyphosate was much safer than the other herbicides they had been using. And it's also all-purpose. It kills everything, whereas the other ones were more specialized in different types of weeds. So that it was a boon to growing crops, that you could just spray glyphosate all over the crop and it doesn't die, and all the weeds die. So it was really heralded as a major breakthrough, I think, in agriculture. Unfortunately, they didn't anticipate some of the things that were going to happen later on. One was that the weeds became resistant. They picked up a resistance gene as well. And then you couldn't kill them. You had to put more and more glyphosate to kill the weeds, which made more and more glyphosate show up in the food. And eventually, at this point now, many farmers are faced with a situation where their weeds are so sturdy that glyphosate can't be effective against them. And the industry's offering formulations that have another herbicide besides glyphosate mixed in, as well as resistance to that herbicide as well. So now you've got double genetic engineering against both glyphosate and, for example, dicamba. And then you have a product that contains both of them. And the dicamba is causing a mess here in this country right now because it evaporates and gets on the neighbor's crop and kills it. So you almost have to choose the GMO version of your crop to protect it from the dicamba next door, even if you're not using dicamba. So that's quite a mess that's happening right now in the Midwest, in this country.
Yes. Wow. Okay. Yeah. And there's also the problem, right? If the GMO seeds travel to the next field,
yes,
they're still owned by the original person because it's engineered. It has a patent on it, right?
Right. In fact, you can get in trouble, and farmers have gotten in trouble for GMO crops growing on their fields that they don't want. The crop came in by mistake, and of course it takes over because it's so hardy. And then they're stuck with this GMO crop they don't want. And then the industry will sue them because they've got it on their field and they didn't buy it from them. So it's really a mess. The industry takes advantage of this accidental spread to sue the farmers, which is really, really outrageous.
Yeah, we have a lot of because I'm in Italy, right? And we have a lot of things where it's branded like no GMO. And people are always like, okay, organic, no GMO, okay, we can go with that one.
No, I know that's absolutely right, and I think it's great that Europe is actually, they use a lot fewer. Maybe they have, most of the countries, I think, in Europe don't allow GMO crops. Is that right? Many of the countries in Europe don't allow it. U.S. is completely happy with GMO, and we don't even label it. We had a big fight.
No?
We've had various fights in various states to try to get GMO labeling to take place in this country. And no, don't label it. It's fine. It's perfectly happy. We don't need to know that it's GMO. And certainly products are being labeled non-GMO because the people who know it's not GMO know that's a value added, so they'll label non-GMO. Yes. And then people will gravitate towards buying that if they're concerned about their health. But the problem is non-GMO doesn't mean glyphosate-free by any means. And in fact, the highest levels of glyphosate have been found in non-GMO crops. And this is because they are sprayed routinely, many of them, with glyphosate right before the harvest. And those end up having the glyphosate so close to the harvest, it goes into the seed. And then you get high levels of glyphosate in garbanzo beans, chickpeas, oats, and wheat and barley, and sugarcane. So all of those are sprayed right before harvest in many cases with glyphosate. And of course, no labeling whatsoever. Non-GMO proudly labeled, but it doesn't matter. It's still loaded with glyphosate. The government thinks glyphosate's a wonderful chemical because it's perfectly safe for humans, and that's where I come in, because I started looking. After I heard Don Huber's lecture, I started reading the research literature, and luckily I came upon a paper right away that was by a professor in France, actually. I'm losing his name. Seralini. His team was doing great research on glyphosate, and they basically repeated a study that Monsanto had done, pretty much the same study with rats, same design all the way, except that they kept going after 3 months. So the industry had a rule that if you didn't see any trouble after 3 months, you were good to go. Animal studies, that means it's safe. If you don't see any evidence of harm by 3 months, it's safe. And the industry accepted that as, okay, this chemical is great because, the animals were fine. So it was a low dose of glyphosate, but he did it over the entire lifespan of the rats, and he studied them over the entire lifespan compared to their neighbors who weren't being exposed. And Seralini found all kinds of problems, but they didn't show up until 4 months. So basically the industry was able to disguise the fact that it was toxic. It's a slow kill, and I talk a lot about that in my book. Glyphosate is a slow kill. And that's why people are deceived into thinking that it's safe when it's not.
Right. So what happens, especially in the human body, when glyphosate comes in?
Oh my God, it's so complicated. I would recommend you read my book. I have, each chapter is sort of a different topic. Like I have a chapter on the gut, a chapter on the neurological disease, and a chapter, of course, on autism, and I have some chapters on mechanisms, a couple of chapters, one of which is, I think, very important, maybe central to the book, was my understanding, my prediction or my hypothesis that glyphosate is doing something very, very interesting in biology that's unique to glyphosate. I don't know of a single other chemical in the universe that does this thing that glyphosate does, which is to substitute for the amino acid glycine during protein synthesis. And that's kind of a central theme of my book. I think that's what's happening with glyphosate, and I have a whole chapter where I show the evidence, and much of the evidence comes from Monsanto's own research that's happening. And it's quite fascinating biology. And there's analogy in others. It's not like this sort of thing never happens, because there's several chemicals whose toxicity works by substituting for amino acids. They're amino acids, non-coding amino acids that resemble coding amino acids. And if you know biology, the amino acids are the basic building blocks of proteins.
So let's call it puzzle piece, or another piece is going in for another.
Right.
And so okay.
Yes, so glyphosate gets into the protein by mistake in place of glycine, because it is a glycine molecule. It's a complete glycine molecule, but it has an extra thing attached to its nitrogen atom, and that makes all the difference in its behavior. Biophysically and biochemically, it's very different from glycine because of that extra piece. And so it doesn't behave the same way glycine does when you put it into the protein. And you can find, I spent a lot of time reading papers about mutations in proteins. So you can find a protein where it has a certain glycine. It's always there, like various amino acids are mutating. You have different strains, different variants of that protein, but you always have glycine at that spot. That means that glycine is important. That's how they figure out, that's got to be important to that protein. And then you find the rare case where that glycine isn't glycine. The proteins are wrecked. You can't work at all. And they've seen, like, substituting aspartate for glycine, or even substituting alanine for glycine, which is a minimal change. That's just an extra methyl group. And for example, myosin, the contractile protein in muscle, it has 11 glycines that are highly conserved, meaning that they're likely important to it. And there's one in particular. There was a lovely paper about this one glycine. And in the experiment, they replaced it with alanine, one extra methyl group, very small change, smaller, much smaller than what glyphosate would do. And then that protein could only, the protein that had that wrong version, could only contract to like 1 or 2% of capacity. It was completely ruined as far as its ability to contract. So if you think about myosin in the gut, and if you suspect that glyphosate's randomly throwing itself into various myosin molecules, this paper even showed that if only 2% of the myosin proteins had this mutation, and 98% were fine, the muscle could only contract it at 50% capacity.
Wow, that's a huge change. Wow.
Yeah, so I think contractile strength of the gut gets destroyed by glyphosate, and then you get constipation, and constipation is one of the conditions that's going up dramatically in step with glyphosate usage on crops.
Oh yes, and then like things are not moving and they're sitting there and not.
You get SIBO, right? Small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, because the food's not moving through it. It stays in the gut too long, and then the bacteria come up into the. Because usually they're contained in most of the bacteria are in the colon.
Right. And then all the wrong kind of. Not nutrients, but like chemicals and particles are going into the bloodstream and into the brain and others.
Well, yes, glyphosate has been shown experimentally to cause leaky gut. You know, we've had a lot of talk about leaky gut syndrome, or leaky gut in general here in the United States. Certainly that's a conversation that many people are aware of, that the gut barrier becomes compromised and things leak out. And that can be really big trouble, and especially combined with defective protein metabolism, which I think glyphosate also causes. And I wrote about both of those in my book. It's quite interesting. First of all, it's been shown in studies that glyphosate causes leaky gut. And then there's the issue of glyphosate messing up the gut microbiome. That's definitely going on. And we have so many people with issues with their gut. Of course, the constipation is part of that. But also, I think it's disrupting the breakdown of proteins, the digestion of proteins, and particularly proteins that have a lot of proline. So proline is an unusual amino acid that's difficult to break apart from its neighbors. And so there are specialized enzymes that know how to specifically break apart proline. And those enzymes, the gut microbes provide those enzymes to the host. And so lactobacillus in particular has like 4 different enzymes that specialize in breaking proline apart from its neighbors. And lactobacillus is very sensitive to glyphosate. So that what happens is that the wheat and casein in milk are they're proteins that have a lot of proline in them, and so they become very difficult to metabolize, to use as a source of energy when you've got trouble with your microbes, when your lactobacillus are deficient, and especially because I even think those enzymes are being disrupted by glyphosate, but I haven't been able to prove that. But I speculate that would be the case, And then there's not enough lactobacillus to help to break down the milk, and so the baby's born. It can't digest milk, and you put it on a formula with soy, and the soy is probably loaded with glyphosate, and now it's going down a really bad path.
But that would already be in the mother's milk, right? The
mother's milk has glyphosate in it, yes. Not always, of course, but Zen Honeycutt is a friend of mine. I don't know if you know Zen Honeycutt. She's awesome. She's the founder of an organization called Moms Across America. And she's been very active, as an activist, trying to get the message out, directing at moms to say, you got to, feed your kids well and organic food. And she's very, very engaged in this whole message, getting the message out to mothers about the dangers of glyphosate. And she's actually done some interesting tests through Moms Across America, and one was she got breast milk from a number of different women who were nursing their babies, and then she sent it off to be tested for glyphosate, and 1/3 of the mothers came back with glyphosate positive breast milk.
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah.
Wow.
So there's glyphosate in the breast milk, and it has a lot of proline in it, and you have trouble digesting the casein in the milk, and then you get milk intolerance, and then the child is put on a soy formula.
Yeah, and then the soy obviously has also been treated with glyphosate. And
it's a GMO Roundup Ready crop. Most of the soy grown in this country is GMO Roundup Ready.
That's a recipe for disaster.
Yes.
Oh my God! Wow. Because I read your paper, one of your papers. I have it here, but it's about the manganese one.
Oh,
and
yes.
you were talking about, it's like 50 pages.
That was a big paper, wasn't it? That was a lot of work. I remember that one. That was my second of 6 papers that I published together with Anthony Samsel. He and I collaborated on 6 papers, and that was the second one of those 6. We did one on gluten intolerance as well.
Yeah, there's so many places that glyphosate disrupts the body. It's incredible.
Yes, the manganese is very interesting. And of course, all the metals, and that's something that I need to bring up because glyphosate is a fantastic metal chelator, and particularly what they call the +2 cations. And manganese, cobalt, zinc, iron, magnesium, those are all, glyphosate grabs hold of them and won't let go. And so it actually keeps them away from the gut microbes. Starting off, in fact, the lactobacillus critically depend on manganese. They're actually interesting that way, that they have they can use manganese very effectively to protect themselves from oxidation damage. And glyphosate doesn't let them have the manganese. It keeps it away from them, and they become manganese deficient, and then that's part of what kills them. And then also glyphosate basically holds onto the manganese and delivers it to the liver. And then the liver normally, actually, it's interesting, the liver normally attaches manganese to the bile acids and then ships it back to the gut, attached to the bile acids. And then eventually it goes into what's called the chylomicron, which is this giant lipid particle that is in the gut that's used to process fats. When you're eating fats, your gut produces the chylomicron, which is sent via the lymph system over to it comes into a big vein here, and goes right into the heart. So the heart is supplying, which is an interesting point because the heart is being supplied gets the first dibs on the fats that you're eating. And this is very interesting because people say high-fat diet is bad for heart disease, and that's completely broken in my opinion. Fats are actually good for you and good for your heart. And so, and especially cholesterol.
I found the same, yes.
Yes, so I advocate a high cholesterol diet even for people with heart disease, which is surprising to those who have heard the industry messaging. Because the statin drug, they figured out statin drugs can clobber your LDL levels. They're very effective at reducing your liver's ability to make LDL, the lipid particles. And then they've convinced people that you've got to get your LDL levels low in order to protect yourself from heart disease. And then they feed them these statin drugs, which are extremely toxic. And I've written papers about statin drugs. I think they're... I don't think anybody benefits from a statin drug.
What have you found are the consequences of taking them?
Oh my, they cause all kinds of problems. Arthritis, brain fog, muscle pain. Muscle pain and weakness is a huge one. Parkinson's disease, even dementia, I believe, is correlated. Cholesterol is essential for animals. Animals depend upon cholesterol the way plants depend upon chlorophyll. It's really an essential. And there's no cholesterol in plants. It's really a special molecule made by animals. And I've written a whole bunch of papers actually around the idea of cholesterol sulfate being an incredibly important molecule. And part of the story with glyphosate is that it's messing up the sulfation system. And I talk a lot about that in my book. It's really fascinating. A couple of enzymes that are really critical for attaching sulfate to a fat-soluble molecule. And those enzymes, I believe, are getting disrupted by glyphosate, meaning that the cholesterol can't be sulfated. And in the liver, it's been shown experimentally that cholesterol sulfate is a tremendous benefit to the liver. It allows it to release the bile acids, it cuts away fatty liver disease, it solves a lot of problems. But the cholesterol version, it's a hydroxycholesterol sulfate. And that same hydroxycholesterol without the sulfate does the opposite. So the sulfate is super important for making cholesterol fat water soluble, making it water soluble, and also for allowing the lipid particles to have negative charge around them. It's quite interesting biology or biophysics maybe, that the cholesterol sulfate goes into the membrane of the lipid particle And the sulfate sticks out into the water, and that makes the lipid particle water soluble, but it also builds a gel around the lipid particle to protect it from whatever else is in the blood that might attack it. So oxidation damage, glycation damage, those things are much less if the lipid particle has enough sulfate in its membrane. And so when the liver can't make cholesterol sulfate, it's in really big trouble. It messes up a lot of things the liver normally does and causes liver toxicity, but also causes high cholesterol because the liver is stuck putting the cholesterol inside the LDL particle and has to ship more. So the LDL goes up because it doesn't have enough sulfate, and the LDL that's there is less protected because it doesn't have enough sulfate in its membrane. So it's really devastating when the liver can't make enough cholesterol sulfate.
So interesting. Okay, so let's go to the topic we discussed that we would talk about today, which is deuterium and glyphosate, which when you sent me the email and said like those two are related, I was like, what? How is this possible? It's such a niche topic, but deuterium is so interesting. When did you first find out about deuterium, and then when did you connect it to glyphosate?
Right, good questions. So actually I didn't even really know that deuterium played any role in the body until December of 2019. I remember it well. I had just published a paper together with Dr. Greg Nye. He and I have collaborated on a number of papers. He's a terrific guy. And we had published a paper on sulfate, actually, and on glyphosate and messing up cobalamin and then causing all kinds of metabolic problems related to sulfate. So we had published this paper, and it talked a lot about sort of biological pathways. And there's a guy named Professor Laszlo Boros who reached out to me blind. He sent me an email. He said, "Oh, I loved your paper. By the way, by the way, deuterium." Basically, that's what this message said. "Do you know about deuterium? Here's my paper, a paper I wrote on deuterium. Please take a look." And so I did, and I was like, "Oh my God!" It was an immediate click for me. It was immediate that I said, "Oh my God, glyphosate's going to mess up deuterium." It was so clear to me. And again, it was just like with the autism, and I had studied autism for 5 years. And then I discovered glyphosate. It fit so well, I knew it was right. And the same thing with deuterium. As soon as I discovered deuterium, I knew it was right. That is a major deuterium disruption in the body, just like manganese disruption, is a major problem in the context of chronic glyphosate poisoning. That's what I think. And this is a new topic to almost everybody, even researchers who are experts in biology. Most of them, their eyes glaze over when you say deuterium. They have no clue what it's about or why it's important. We need to get, I really am on a new mission now to get the message out about deuterium. And I'm hoping that more people will catch on and start looking at the research literature. The literature is pretty scarce, because so few people have written about it. So it's a challenge to find the story. And part of what you have to do is to find papers that show you which enzymes are very skilled at choosing hydrogen over deuterium. That's part of the story. That's quite fascinating by itself. And what I found out very quickly was that flavoproteins, the whole class of proteins called flavoproteins, that are able to select, that they're very selective to prefer hydrogen over deuterium. So if I have a substrate over here, and I need to yank a hydrogen atom out of it and stick it on my product, if that hydrogen is not hydrogen but rather deuterium, I won't touch it. I just leave it alone. I'll go get the next one. These enzymes have that skill. And I should say what deuterium is, because a lot of people probably don't know what it is, but it's a heavy hydrogen. It's also known as heavy hydrogen. It's a hydrogen atom with an extra neutron. So the hydrogen is the smallest, it's on the upper left corner of the periodic table. 1 proton, 1 electron, that's it. Deuterium has 1 proton, 1 electron, 1 neutron, which makes it twice as heavy as hydrogen. It's natural in nature. It's not radioactive, but it's present in water, for example, in seawater at 155 parts per million. So that may sound small, but in the blood, it's actually 5 times as high concentration as calcium in the blood. So in terms of the number of deuterium atoms, it's not uncommon at all. That's because hydrogen is so common. Most of our atoms in our body are hydrogen. I should learn the number, but it's a huge percentage of the atoms in our body are hydrogen, because it's a little tiny thing and it's all over the place. It hooks to all the carbons, the nitrogen, everything else is hooked to hydrogen, like carbohydrates, right? The hydrate is hydrogen.
Right.
So there's tons and tons of hydrogen.
I didn't think about this before.
Yeah, so So 155 parts per million, every million hydrogen atoms, you've got 155 deuterium atoms, but that's still a lot of deuterium compared to like manganese or copper or iron or calcium. Much more. Many more molecules, many more atoms of deuterium than there are of those other rare minerals, in the body. And deuterium, because it's twice as heavy, has very different properties compared to hydrogen. And so many enzymes are critically, hydrogen is involved in almost all the reactions. Somewhere somebody's yanking off a hydrogen, sticking it to oxygen, making water, all these different reactions that go on involve hydrogen, hugely involve hydrogen.
Right.
And the tricky thing is that the mitochondria hate deuterium. This is what Laszlo taught me in that first paper that he shared with me. The mitochondria hate deuterium. And so that was just so fascinating to me, because I was already aware that glyphosate causes mitochondrial stress. It causes increased reactive oxygen species. Mitochondria, I have to get back off a bit, they're these little organelles inside the cells that make energy for the cell. They make ATP. And that's the famous oxidative phosphorylation. And they also have the citric acid cycle, which is where they break down glucose and other nutrients and turn them into, they turn oxygen into water, and then they break down the molecules of glucose all the way and produce carbon dioxide. So they're basically producing carbon dioxide and water from fats and carbohydrates and stuff like that. So with the citric acid cycle, they're breaking down those nutrients and spewing out ATP. They're making ATP, which is the energy source. It's like the currency of the cell. So the mitochondria are super, super important, and mitochondrial disease or mitochondrial dysfunction is associated with a huge list of chronic diseases. Huge list have mitochondrial dysfunction as part of the story.
Right. There's a whole new mitochondrial field evolving where instead of looking at the genetics, they look at the function of the mitochondria and how then that influences the output of the cell.
That's right. And in fact, cancer cells, there's a lot written about the mitochondria of cancer cells because they're really interesting. Cancer cells have a totally different metabolic policy compared to normal cells. And part of that policy involves chewing on lots and lots of glucose. They love sugar, but they don't process it in the citric acid cycle to make ATP. They mostly don't. They even might have healthy mitochondria, but they don't use them to make ATP. It's really, really interesting. Even when they're healthy, they don't. Many of them have unhealthy mitochondria, and that's because they've gotten damage to the DNA in the mitochondria as a consequence of reactive oxygen. So the mitochondria produce more reactive oxygen and less ATP when they've got too much deuterium in their water. They love to have very low deuterium in their water because it gums up the ATP. ATPase pumps, the pumps that make the ATP, hate deuterium. It gums them up, sort of like putting sugar in the gas tank is an analogy I like to draw.
Is that engine going to work? I never tried it.
And so when there's too much deuterium in the mitochondria, they get sick. And when they spew out more reactive oxygen, they can damage their own DNA. And then they can have mitochondrial mutations, and then they're completely busted and they don't work at all. So there's, a lot of danger with too much deuterium. And in fact, there's a critical enzyme that I talk about in my book, succinate dehydrogenase. It's an enzyme that's present in the mitochondria, and that is the only enzyme that plays a role in both the citric acid cycle, which is what's basically breaking down the sugar, and the oxidative phosphorylation, which is what's making the ATP. Those two things are going on in the mitochondria simultaneously, and this enzyme plays a role in both of them, succinate dehydrogenase. And there are people who have mutations in that enzyme that make it not work. And those mutations give them a much higher risk to a whole bunch of cancers. So basically, when succinate dehydrogenase is not working, the mitochondria are in big trouble as far as making ATP is concerned. And they have to find a workaround, a whole other way of doing it, and to not use that enzyme but still be able to function. And there are other ways to do it, which are very, very interesting. And the cancer cells use those other ways. And I just did a talk, actually, a couple days ago on deuterium and on glyphosate, on the topic of this. And in that talk, I had a lot of slides on cancer because it's so interesting how they actually use proline. Remember I mentioned proline earlier?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Proline has the first reaction in modifying proline to produce other things. Proline can be a precursor to other amino acids, such as glutamate. You can convert proline to glutamate with some reactions. And the first step And you can also convert it to arginine, I think to glycine. There's a bunch of things you can convert it to. But the first step involves this reaction that's very much like the reaction of succinate dehydrogenase. Both of them end up yanking a couple of hydrogens out of the molecule and tossing them to the mitochondria. So they basically put them into what's called the inner membrane of the intramembrane space. They stick those hydrogens in there, and those hydrogens are really beautiful hydrogens because all the enzymes that made the proline or that made the succinate knew how to select hydrogen over deuterium. So it's giving the mitochondria protons that are healthy, protons that are not going to be deuterons, either from succinate dehydrogenase or from this proline dehydrogenase that does the same thing with proline as a substrate. So the cancer cells are very interesting, and I've been reading a lot about cancer cells and proline because I found it so interesting. Proline is very common in the collagen. Collagen is the most common protein in the body. It's the glue, it's all over the place. It's on the extracellular matrix. It's in the exterior around the cells, collagen. And it's what, it makes your muscles healthy and it makes your skin healthy. I mean, it's just in your brain. Collagen is everywhere. And it's an interesting molecule that has a long sequence of GXY, where every third amino acid is a glycine. So this makes collagen susceptible to glyphosate's mischief. And there are people who have mutations in glycines and collagen that cause serious disease. So that's one of the problems with collagen. Glyphosate's messing it up. But collagen also has lots and lots of proline. It has a lot of glycine and a lot of proline compared to most other proteins. And the cancer cells chew up their extracellular matrix. They basically send out these enzymes that break it down. They take the collagen inside. They bring it inside the cell. They break it down. And that releases a lot of glycine and a lot of proline, both of which they need for the purpose of making more cells, because that's what they basically do. They just keep copying themselves, right? That's their game. And so they need the glycine and they need the proline to do that. And they need the proline to substitute for succinate dehydrogenase because it's broken. So they use the proline to do that. And in the process, they make glutamate. And they can actually send glutamate into the citric acid cycle to produce ATP. So they have a really interesting strategy where they break down the proline to make glutamate to digest. And in the meantime, they're supplying those protons, those healthy protons, to their inner membrane space from proline instead of from succinate, because the succinate dehydrogenase is busted. And then there are papers that show that glyphosate suppresses succinate dehydrogenase. So that all ties together, that glyphosate's messing up that enzyme, which is a very high risk factor for various kinds of cancers. And then the cancer cells does this other strategy of taking out its matrix in order to do that, because that gives it a lot more mobility, so it can metastasize and things like that. It can cut loose because it's cutting up its matrix. It also makes the matrix, so it's busy tearing down its matrix and making its matrix. But in the meantime, it's using proline. It makes proline, and it also feeds proline into the citric acid cycle. And so the prolines that get chosen to dump their hydrogen, those are the ones that don't have deuterium. And so in the process of this recycling, they end up with extra deuterium in their matrix. They end up with, after they've torn it down and built it back, torn it down, built it back, meanwhile they're pulling all the good prolines out and supplying hydrogen to their mitochondria. And then their matrix has more deuterium. It's enriched in deuterium. I suspect that this hasn't been proven yet, but it makes sense to me because you're going to take away the ones that don't have deuterium. Ones that are left over are going to be high deuterium. You put them back into the matrix. And I suspect that extra matrix in the extra deuterium in the matrix is a good thing because it makes it's better able to make gelled water. And so it gets back to sulfate deficiency because the gelled water depends on the sulfate, heparin sulfate and chondroitin sulfate in the matrix. And those are going to be defective because glyphosate's messing up the sulfation system. So you don't have enough sulfate, you have weak gelled water, and I think the gelled water is what's driving protons into the cell from the external space, according to Gerald Pollack's theories. And I don't know if you're familiar with Gerald Pollack, but he's done...
Yeah, I had him on the podcast.
Great, that's great. He's a great guy. He's a friend of mine. Yeah. Really, he's really wonderful.
Oh.
That's another whole space that I got introduced to along my path of studying biology. I learned all about Gerald's work. I read both of his books, Gels, Cells, and the Engines of Life, and then the fourth phase of water. Really fascinating. The fourth phase is the gelled water, and the gel actually creates a battery. It produces negative charge inside the gel, which is surrounding the cell, and then it pumps the protons out. And what it pumps out, the protons it pumps out, I suspect, are deuterium depleted, because if deuterium is better able to hang on to the gel. So it's a beautiful system. It's just so creative that biology has come up with to solve the deuterium problem. And then you have glyphosate messing everything up.
Right. So I'm going to try to explain it in a few simple words what you just said. Okay. Please
good.
Correct me if I get it wrong.
Good.
So we have the cell with the mitochondria, and then there's the different proteins that need to be synthesized to make energy, and they have the high in the correct scenario, they have the hydrogen, so the proton, not the deuterium, that gets taken into the mitochondria, and then it does its thing, puts it back together again, and back and forth, and then that creates the energy and also different kind of building materials, right?
Yeah, well, the mitochondria are interesting because they can kind of run in two different modes, and one mode is basically breaking down molecules to make ATP, and the other mode is actually building molecules out. So there's these intermediates in the mitochondria that the cell can actually ship out into the cytoplasm and then use them to make resources to, for example, copy the cell. So if you're going to make nucleotides, you have to make a bunch of nucleotides to make your DNA, because you've got to copy all your DNA. If you're a cancer cell, you have to copy everything. You have to copy your membrane. You know, you need a lot of raw materials to make two of yourself. You're basically growing by a factor of 2. So you need all these materials. So you basically, the cancer cell gets its energy by glycolysis, which is an anaerobic process that takes glucose and turns it, and they actually turn it into lactate. The cancer cells make lots of lactate. And lactate is actually a very healthy fuel. It's a great substitute for glucose. And the lactate actually has low deuterium protons on it because of the way it's made. Oh. So it's a really good nutrient. In fact, the brain and the heart and the liver, they all love lactate. They use it as an alternative fuel. And so cancer cells pour out lactate. They dump it out into the circulation. And they get it from glucose. They eat lots of sugar, and people have sort of been told low sugar diet if you've got cancer to try to keep them from growing. They eat lots of sugar, they make lots of lactate, and that lactate is actually valuable to the host because it's providing this healthy alternative nutrient that's low in deuterium to help solve the global within the organism deuterium problem, because all the cells in the organism are suffering from too much deuterium because of this disrupted metabolism that's been going on with all this exposure to glyphosate, and probably other things as well, but certainly glyphosate. And so so they make the lactate, and they're generating ATP. They only get a little bit of ATP out of glucose when you turn it into lactate. If you can take it in the citric acid cycle, you get a lot more. It's something like 2 molecules of ATP in the glycolysis, and then another like 40 or something in the citric acid cycle. So you have to chew on a lot of glucose to get enough energy if you're a cancer cell, and if you're not going to use your mitochondria to make energy. And then they have these intermediates, and they pull in this glutamate. They love glutamate as well. Cancer cells take in lots of glucose and lots of glutamate. And glutamate is an amino acid, and it's the one that can be made from proline. And the glutamate, it can also make proline. So with going back and forth between proline and glutamate, the cancer cell is happy to do that. And every time it does that cycle, it's providing some protons to the mitochondria in place of the succinate dehydrogenase that's not working. So it goes back and forth between proline and glutamate. The cancer cell does that to help to substitute for the defective succinate dehydrogenase. It's complicated, but it's fascinating. I find it really fascinating, and I feel like I'm beginning to really have a handle on why cancer cells behave so strangely. You know, there's been a lot of papers recently about the dysfunctional, derailed metabolic policy in cancer cells. It's so different from normal cells. And I think the reason is because they're actually trying to supply the host with a healthy deuterium-depleted nutrient, which is the lactate. They're giving that to the heart, to the brain, and to the liver, which are very critical organs that need to be healthy. And then they're multiplying themselves, and they're making actually deuterium-depleted, I suspect, they're making deuterium-depleted molecules, like their nucleotides are deuterium-depleted, and maybe even their fats are deuterium-depleted. So they're basically making a big pile of stuff that can be a good resource for the host to solve its problems if the immune cells can eat it. And the problem is the immune cells are not healthy. And they're sick in part because they don't have enough sulfate. And so this all goes back to the sulfate problem, I think. I think the sulfate problem is a huge factor in cancer.
Do you think sulfate or deuterium is like, which one weighs heavier in the health or in that?
Yeah. In
that cycle.
Yeah, that's a hard problem to answer. In fact, they help each other because the sulfate makes the gel, and the gel pushes out the protons that are deuterium depleted, and then it feeds the protons into the cell, I think, along the cytoskeletal channels, almost like sending electricity along a wire, right? So they're sending the protons into the cell, traveling along the cytoskeleton, and then the mitochondria hang on to the cytoskeleton and they pick up those protons. So I think that's a very efficient way to deliver low deuterium protons to the mitochondria that gets derailed when there's not enough sulfate. So the sulfate's making the gel's making the energy, a battery basically, and those protons are deuterium depleted that are being fed to the cell. So that whole system becomes weak when there's not enough sulfate. And also not enough sulfate causes the cell to be no longer protected from anything that might be coming along in the blood that might poison it. You know, the cell builds this layer that is safe, makes a safe barrier, just like the LDL particle makes a safe barrier of gel because of the sulfate in the cholesterol sulfate. And the cell has the heparin sulfate, chondroitin sulfate, and also cholesterol sulfate. All these sulfated molecules in the membrane that are making the gel and that are building a shield around the cell so that it's protected against, any kind of damage. And certainly the endothelial lining of the blood vessels is very susceptible to anything in the blood that might be toxic. And so it needs to have that healthy, thick gel. It's exclusion zone water. Gerald calls it exclusion zone water. It excludes things that could get inside the water because of the gel. Kind of builds like a crystal. I call it liquid ice. You know, the crystal that's built in the gelled water. The crystal doesn't support other things getting in because it's a crystal, as opposed to just being water molecules bouncing around in the liquid. That's very, very different.
So what do you think is the solution except from stop using glyphosate?
Stop eating glyphosate, contaminated. Yeah, I know. Yeah, avoiding glyphosate is already a really tough problem, especially if you live in the United States. It's in the air, it's in the water, it's in the food. Very difficult to avoid. Even I think it's I don't know. I've been talking about the possibility of glyphosate being introduced into the air through biofuels, and the biofuel industry has really heated up in the last few years. And in fact, Europe uses a lot of biodiesel. And they're increasing the amount of biodiesel in their diesel fuel, and they have a lot of diesel cars.
Wait, so they mix the glyphosate with the fuel?
They don't intentionally, but Europe, for example, imports a lot of biofuel from South America.
Okay.
Argentina.
So the crops were grown with the glyphosate.
Soy, GMO Roundup Ready soy becomes biofuel from Argentina, gets imported into Europe and put into the gas tank of the car. And I think that glyphosate is getting out into the air. If it reaches combustion, it'll be broken down. But even then, it's going to release nitrogen, which is also not good. Extra nitrogen in the air. And in fact, there have been studies on pollution in Europe that have shown high nitrogen in the air from the fuels being toxic. Too much nitrogen oxides. Of course, that also causes global climate change because nitrous oxide is 100 times as bad as carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. And so nitrogen is a big problem with respect to global heating up the atmosphere. But so then the nitrogen is part of glyphosate, but also the glyphosate itself, if it escapes combustion, for example, just evaporates as you're filling up the gas tank, the gas is being poured into it can evaporate into the air. The glyphosate can be pulled out of get out into the atmosphere. In fact, Anthony Samsel and my buddy, he did some studies. He got people to gather water samples from rain. In their environment, and I gave them 3 samples actually, one from my home in Hawaii, one from my home in Winchester, Massachusetts, and one from at my work at MIT. And the Hawaii and the Winchester came out negative, but the one at MIT was contaminated with glyphosate, the rain. And I think it picked it up from the atmosphere, because in the city you have a lot of cars and buses that are running on biofuels that are releasing. At least that's my hypothesis. It hasn't been studied or proven by anybody, but that's just something I'm putting out there for people to think about. So
it makes it a kind of inescapable problem. Is there anything that can block the glyphosate from working in the body?
Yes, I mean, that's something that people are investigating. Of course, people who are interested in treating people who are sick are looking for ways to help solve the problem, and they've come up with some ways that they think are beneficial. Again, it hasn't been necessarily, controlled studies, but there have been a lot of evidence of people who treat those who have like if someone has high glyphosate in their urine, and then they're not healthy, and then you want to try something and then test and see if there's some work that's gone on like that. In fact, cows was an article about cows that I really appreciated that was done in Europe, actually, and these cows were sick, and they tested glyphosate. They found a high glyphosate in their urine. Of course, they're eating this GMO food. That's really, the cows probably get even more exposure to glyphosate than we do in their diet. And,
definitely.
And so the cows were sick, and they had the glyphosate in their urine. And so what they did to treat them, they used bentonite clay, sauerkraut juice, and fulvic acid and humic acid. I remember this well because I found that was really, really interesting. And so some practitioners are trying, all of those things are perfectly fine for humans as well. And so some of my naturopath friends are trying that out and having what they think is good success in terms of helping to remove the glyphosate. And I guess those fulvic acid and humic acid are a natural choice because they bind to lots of things. And they even have enzymes in them that are very versatile. So the hope is that they have some enzymes in the fulvic acid that could break down glyphosate. Again, I don't think that's been proven by anybody, but that is theoretical. And the other thing that I wonder about is probiotics. And I was looking for microbes. It turns out glyphosate has a very tough bond called a CP bond, carbon-phosphorus bond, very, very unusual. And human cells are stumped by that. They have no clue how to break that apart. Whereas a few of the microbes can do it, only a few. So I was looking through the literature to find out which microbes could break down that CP bond. And I came across an article on a strain of Acetobacter that could break it down.
What's Acetobacter?
Acetobacter is a microbe that's common in, so like acetic acid, it's common in vinegar and sauerkraut juice.
Okay.
So probiotics.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so possibly, and I'm speculating again. I have a lot of things that are speculation that haven't been proven. So I have an imaginative mind, so I come up with these things. But I think it's possible that probiotics, and so, and of course they're really healthy foods in general because they're helping to renew your gut microbiome, and they have nice enzymes. In fact, like for example, lactate is produced by those. If you take yogurt or, of course, milk. Milk has lactose. It gets converted to lactate by these microbes. Lactate is a super healthy food. So the contents that are produced by the microbes by processing the original foods become healthier as a consequence of the microbial action. They're kind of helping you get started on your digestion in a way. They're doing part of the digestion for you, which makes it easier for you to digest it. So I love sour cream. I love sour cream, and that's, I think, a really healthy food. So fermented dairy products. Of course, I also love cheeses. I love blue cheese, which is a sort of an acquired taste, but I eat blue cheese almost every day. And so fermented foods, fermented dairy, or, of course, cabbage, sauerkraut is a good one, too. And then vinegar. We always use... my husband is the cook in our family, and he makes salad dressing from scratch, and he puts in organic... apple cider vinegar in his salad dressing. So you can use organic vinegar, which again has acetate in it, and so it's Acetobacter that are likely to be common in that food, and so they can break down the glyphosate in your mouth actually before it even gets to your gut. That would be the hope. But again,
that'd be great.
Not proven, so that's just speculation. But on the other hand, fermented foods are good for you anyway, so you sort of might as well, right? And then the other thing, of course, is glycine. I have friends who are suggesting taking glycine as a supplement because if you have enough glycine, you're less likely to get glyphosate into your proteins. So just making sure you have plenty of glycine. And I would advocate bone broth, organic bone broth, because there's a lot of glycine in collagen, and there's collagen in the bone broth. And so people can also buy collagen. They can take collagen as a supplement, or take gelatin, which is derived from collagen. Those are going to have lots and lots of glycine. Again, make sure it's organic, because otherwise you're going to be taking glyphosate as well.
In collagen?
Yes, collagen is the GXY. It's got tons of glycine, so I think it's going to have glyphosate in it if, in fact, glyphosate is substituting for glycine during protein synthesis. And it comes from the cows and the pigs that are eating lots of glyphosate-contaminated foods.
Oh, okay.
In fact, gel caps is another issue.
Now.
Gel caps are from collagen. And people take lots of supplements with gel caps, and they might be getting a lot of glyphosate in the gel caps. But again, it hasn't been proven, but I would suspect that.
It's everywhere.
Yeah, it's a bit challenging. Of course, eating certified organic is by far the most important thing you can do, and we do that. When we shop, we don't buy it unless it's, when we shop for food, we always make sure it's certified organic. And luckily, there's a pretty good supply and a growing supply in the United States. I'm pleased to see, first of all, that there's more options that they're offering even in the common grocery stores. And also that it's flying off the shelves, because sometimes you'll be at the grocery store and all the vegetables are there except for the organics, and they're all gone, because people bought them already. So there's an increasing demand, which is motivating the grocery stores to stock more. So I think there's a good momentum going in this country in the direction. Probably there too. I don't know if you've noticed that as well.
Yes, we definitely have a movement towards more organic. I live very rurally, so we have lots of apple and wine plantations everywhere around us in my region. But those are not really organic.
Yes. Yeah, wine is unfortunate. That's another one that Zen Honeycutt tested. She tested California wines, several different ones, including biodynamic and organic. And I think she found glyphosate in all the wines that she tested. Right. All of them were positive. But the organics had a lot less than the non-organics. But they're picking it up from their neighbors, because if you've got an organic farm where you're growing, an orchard where you're growing grapes for wine, and all your neighbors are not organic, there's not a barrier at your boundary that says, oh, glyphosate, don't spill over here. When they're spraying it out of the airplane, you're going to get some on your crops. You can't help it. So it's really kind of sad. That I really want a revolution. I'm hoping that the population will demand organic so much that farmers will increasingly want to think about converting. And it's not easy to go to organic if you have been growing non-organic for a long time. It takes years to get to the point where you can pass the test. So you've got an in-between time when you're not using chemicals, but you can't sell your product as an organic. You can't be certified organic because you still got glyphosate in your soil, So you have to it's a process that's very difficult for a farmer to decide he's going to do that. And looking to the future, the bright future beyond those 3 or 4 years when he can start selling his crop as an organic crop, and to hold on during that intervening time. I really would love to see the government change their policy about who they subsidize, because right now our government is really subsidizing the toxic huge farms. And so the small farmer is really hurting hard because he doesn't get the subsidy from the government. And of course it's organic, and so it's basically he has to sell his product for more money, and then if people don't recognize the importance of it, they'll be inclined to buy the one that's got the glyphosate in it, and then it makes it hard for that farmer to succeed. So we need to get the message out to the population that they need to insist on certified organic, or to have a farmer who you trust, who can say, I don't use chemicals. That's ideal. If you've got a local farmer who doesn't use chemicals, buy from him, even if he hasn't been through the certification process, because that process costs money, and a lot of these small farmers don't have a lot of money. So some of them are growing organic without certification. But you really have to work on making sure to choose healthy food. I think that's super, super important. And of course, not just organic, but also not processed, minimally processed. I really emphasize that. And I actually think the best way to improve your health, as far as getting rid of glyphosate, is to improve your immune system. and such that your immune cells are capable of clearing garbage. Because what happens if you have these proteins that are broken because of glyphosate, for example, and if your immune cells are not competent to remove them, then they can become really toxic. You can even get things like Alzheimer's because of misfolded proteins that accumulate because your cells are unable to get rid of them.
Right.
And so having a healthy immune system is number one in my book as far as being healthy. And part of that involves sulfur, so you want to be able to eat a lot of sulfur-containing foods, and which I do. We're very big on garlic, for example, is a terrific sulfur-containing food.
Oh, really?
And you probably use a lot of garlic in Italy, right?
Oh, so much.
It
needs to be in everything.
It's so great. I love garlic, and we use garlic extensively in our cooking. And fresh from the clove, you go all the way. And that's been a process for us because we used to buy powdered garlic, and then we bought sort of jars of chopped up garlic. And then we started buying, whole cloves of garlic and chopping them up. I mean, my husband's been very good at getting more and more pure about his food, So, and he likes to use a lot of herbs too. I mean, herbs are also really good. So I think, and garlic, of course, is it's a spice for sure. Ginger, garlic, turmeric is a fantastic food. Turmeric, and that's like curry, curry powders. In India, they use a lot of turmeric, and they have low rates of Alzheimer's, and people suspect that's connected. Turmeric is really good for Alzheimer's or dementia. And then the herbs. We actually have a little herb garden where we grow oregano and basil and mint, and rosemary. So we just have a little herb garden in the back that we use for fresh herbs. And I really think it's important. Again, we used to just use the powder, then we started buying organic powder, and they were like, no, we have to buy it fresh. So we keep on, going up the scale. Yes. And I feel it's been important to do that, to really think in terms of whole foods and all the way from scratch, to take the extra time, chop up the basil, put it into the food. So we just try very hard to use herbs and spices whenever we can. In cooking. My husband is Chinese, and a lot of what we eat is stir-fried. And you have lots and lots of veggies, and various exotic veggies that most Americans don't eat, And
lots of flavor.
Mustard greens is super, super healthy. And it has a strong taste. So mustard greens is one that we really like. And, of course, just Chinese cabbage, bok choy, that sort of thing.
Broccoli. Yeah, that's really good.
Broccolis are really good food. That's a good sulfur source as well. In fact, all of the cruciferous vegetables, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, that's another one that we use a lot. Brussels sprouts are really good. So these are all good sources of sulfur, vegetable sources of sulfur. And then for animals, you can also get good sources of sulfur, especially, for example, organic eggs. That's that's a treasure, organic eggs. You should eat a lot of eggs because the egg yolk has super, super high concentration of micronutrients. And so you really want to make sure you get enough micronutrients in your food. So organic eggs, and of course, we eat meats, but we typically, it's a stir-fried with a little bit of meat and a lot of veggies. So I don't think you want to eat so much protein that you have to use protein as a source of energy. You want to eat just enough protein to be able to provide the amino acids to build your own proteins. You don't want to use it as a source of energy, because then you've got that extra nitrogen that's going to cause trouble. So really the fats and the carbohydrates are better to be metabolized for energy to make the ATP. But the protein, you need it because you need those amino acids for the building blocks of your own proteins.
What do you think about consuming deuterium depleted water for health?
I have it right here. Deuterium depleted water. Yeah, I've decided that I believe in it.
Right.
Yeah, I drink one glass. So what I do, and I buy it from a company called Lightwater. Is at drinklightwater.com. You can go to and you can order it and you can have it shipped. It actually comes from
Victor on the podcast too. It's expensive. It's sort of outrageously expensive considering that it's water, and so that kind of turns people off, and they're like, how can I possibly spend that much money for water? And I have a little bit of that trouble too, like, oh my God, it's just water, how can it be so expensive? And part of the reason why it's expensive is because it's made in Russia. It's hard to make, and they have this equipment in Russia, and there aren't there's no place in the United States where they can make it. They don't have the tools to make it. It's just tricky to make. And it's very depleted. Like what I buy has only 10 parts per million versus 155
in regular seawater, or probably most water has probably around 155. But you can get low deuterium water from naturally, which is quite interesting, from glacier water. And in fact, deuterium was first discovered as a health issue in Russia because of these people who lived up north that were super healthy. So they were like, wow, why are these people so healthy? Because they were living up north, they didn't have much sun, and they had a very short growing season. They didn't eat many vegetables. Mostly they ate sort of probably like, I don't know, seals or buffalo. I don't know what they eat. There's like these big animals that live up there. They were eating a lot of meat. And not much variety in terms of vegetables. And they were living to be 110, 120. I mean, they were super healthy until they were old. So they were like, wow, what's going on here? These researchers are trying to figure out why they were so healthy. And they finally concluded after some study, they thought it was the light water, naturally deuterium depleted water coming off the glacier. And that's also sort of supports this idea of the gel providing a trap for deuterium. I think in the body, the gel traps the deuterium, leaving behind deuterium depleted water in the blood. And that's why the sulfate is so important, because that's making the gel. So if you don't have enough gel, you've got too much deuterium in your blood, and that's going to be a problem for everywhere. But the glacier is ice, and so the ice traps deuterium just as gel does, because gel is like liquid ice. So the ice traps deuterium, and the water that comes off the ice is deuterium depleted. It's also, for example, interesting that rain at the equator has more deuterium in it than rain at the poles, and that's because as the water droplet comes down, it's evaporating, and it evaporates more when it's hot, so it loses more water as it comes down, and the water it loses is deuterium depleted. So what's left behind is deuterium rich. So that's quite interesting, that you can get different degrees of deuterium in your drinking water depending upon where it comes from. And in fact, there was an interesting study that I found it really fascinating that was done. They looked at the 50 states of the United States, and they looked at they could find out the amount of deuterium in the regular drinking water in that state. They were able to come up with these numbers from public data, I guess, for each state, how much, what on average is the amount of deuterium in the water supply.
Yes.
And then at the same time, what is the rate of depression in that state? And they found a very strong correlation between depression and high deuterium. And actually, it's really interesting. When I first started looking at deuterium, I found some very old papers from the 1960s. Back in, they learned how to make super high deuterium water during World War II when they were developing the atomic bomb. It's quite interesting that they needed to have deuterium-enriched water for the bomb. And I don't know the details of exactly why they used deuterium-rich water, but that was part of what made the bomb work well. And they learned how to make deuterium-rich water, excess deuterium. And then they thought, well, let's see what happens if you feed this to rats or to mice, what happens to them. And it was amazing what happened to them. Like if they they would give them like a sugar water solution that was loaded with deuterium. And they did that experiment with mice, and I read about one of these papers. It was just incredible because these mice were fed sort of high deuterium water, and apparently it tastes just like water. So you don't know it's toxic. But the mice, they got very vicious, and they got a very ferocious appetite. They were very hungry, and they were vicious. They started attacking each other. And then after a few days, some of them got very lethargic and just kind of lie down there and like, hit me, I don't care. I don't have any energy. And after maybe 10 days or 12 days, all of them died. So it's really, really toxic. High deuterium, super high, never expected to be in nature, is toxic, which just really shows you how important deuterium is in biology. People don't realize that you have any issue there.
It's such a new topic. It's very, very, very niche.
Yeah, it's really, I really want to get it out. I want to get enough people excited about it that they start to look on their own and start to do research and even do maybe experiments, people who have the capability. Would be wonderful to see. And I do know there's, and I'm losing his name, sorry, but there's a guy who's been studying light water as a treatment for cancer. And he's written 2 books about it. I read his second book. If you say it, I'll recognize it.
Laszlo Boros.
It isn't Laszlo, yeah.
No,
but I'm sorry, I have his book too, but I just don't quite remember his name. Sorry.
It's okay.
I'm not good with names, so it could go away quickly. I used to know his name, but it's gone. But he has, and I read his second book. It's a very, it's a tedious book. It just has all these case studies, and each one it describes in detail various people's experiences. It's interesting in that respect. You have all these situations, different people try different things because it's complicated. He didn't do any kind of, well, he might have done some kind of placebo-controlled study, I think a little bit, but he mostly it was just showing that these people that he treated survived much longer with their cancer than others who have that same cancer at that same degree. So he sort of showed that it helped them to live longer, and I think in some cases actually for 20 years, like really lose the cancer. And he talked a lot about if you're getting treated with cancer and when you should and shouldn't take the deuterium, but don't take the deuterium while you're getting the treatment. It's sort of like tricky. He was giving a lot of information in his book, very specific to someone. If I had cancer, I would definitely go look at that book and try to figure out how to deal with it. Personally, I probably would not take the chemotherapy because I think it's stupid to try to kill the cancer. You really want to beef yourself up with all these nutrients that are going to help strengthen your immune system is the number one thing you need to do when you have cancer, because then the immune cells can actually clear the cancer, and that's the whole point. Right. Cancer is begging to be cleared, I think, but the immune cells are incompetent, so they can't. And once they can, then they get this rich deuterium depleted nutrients out of the cancer that can actually help to cure the deuterium problem. So I think the cancer is trying very hard to help the host solve the deuterium problem. That's my opinion. It's kind of a very radical view of cancer.
Yes, I mean, this is more like my belief. I think the body, there's not this kind of defect or evilness or that's happening there. It's just an attempt to do the best you can with what you have. But very often, we have a very toxic world, so it's just failing to do what it actually wants to do. And if the body's just given the right building blocks, right circumstances, it might need a lot of things, but if it's the right combination, it can just do its thing and heal.
I totally agree with you. I think the right way to treat all disease is to focus on eating healthy food, get out in the sunlight, get a lot of sunlight exposure. Because and it's not just the vitamin D, and I really am a big fan of sunlight. Exercise. Make sure you do exercising regularly every day. I just take a couple of walks, one in the morning, one in the evening, every day. And also walking the beach. It doesn't need to be
a lot, right? It just needs to be consistent.
No, I don't do any working out. I don't like to run or anything like that. I just walk. And I think that's, of course, at my age, maybe you don't want to be doing too much, but I'm really healthy and I don't have any arthritis or anything, no aches and pains, which most people my age seem to be kind of having a lot of suffering from, back, right, all that kind of thing. But I've always been a fan of the sun, and of course, eating healthy. I've become really obsessed with eating healthy. As I said, my husband keeps raising the bar, and it's just wonderful to see how much, how far we can go with this game of really eating healthy. And I think that's really, really important. And certainly, if you have cancer, that's what the first thing you want to do is make sure to go organic diet, get out in the sunlight. If you live near the water, walk the beach and walk in the water. You can get good grounding, because that's another thing that people talk about.
Yes.
Grounding is important. So it's really just living in nature, and even walking in the woods. Just what the trees are emitting is sort of things that can be useful to you. It's just a waterfall. Waterfall is an interesting thing. I read actually a paper about waterfalls, and they showed therapeutic benefit of hanging out near the waterfall, and the waterfall actually releases water droplets, and I think those droplets are going to be deuterium depleted. Just like when the rain comes down, the water evaporates. So my suspicion is that when you breathe the air near the waterfall, you're getting deuterium depleted water into your lungs. So that's another wacko theory that I have that may not be true, but it's kind of cool. And then I think the same thing can apply if you've got a lot of waves in the ocean. It's kind of the same concept. Mm-hmm. So, and of course, I love walking along. I live in Hawaii. It's a big benefit. I know not everybody has an ocean nearby to walk by, but we do that a couple times a week. We go take a walk in the water on the ocean. And I love the big waves. They're really fun. So,
can you surf?
No, I wish I had taken that up when I was younger, but no, I really can't surf. That would have been a good thing to be able to do.
That would be fun. Oh, so cool. Wow. Yeah, the water is so fascinating. It's like, because I first started out with like diet, right, in kind of my interest of health. And now I'm more, I've kind of graduated in a way. And it's now water and light more.
Light, yes.
That I'm focusing on. It's so fascinating.
Right.
So
No, all the artificial light, I wonder about that. Even when you live inside a building and most of your time is exposed to these sort of, what do they call the incandescent lights? I'm not sure whether that's healthy light or not. I think there's some issues about the actual spectrum of the light that you're exposed to that's important. And really just natural sunlight is by far the best lighting you can have, and so...
Yeah.
And fresh air, of course, also. So I'm advantaged by living in Hawaii. I can keep the windows open all the time and get really fresh air. So that's also important. So, there's a lot of lifestyle choices you can make. Certainly you don't want to be living near a big highway because that's going to be spewing out a lot of toxic chemicals, not just glyphosate, of course, but all the fumes from the cars.
Yeah.
And monoxide and all the different toxic metals and stuff. There's a lot of junk that's burning from the vehicles that are driving by. So it's been shown, actually, that kids who live near highways have an increased risk to autism.
Oh.
Yeah, just from whatever they're picking up from the highway toxicity. So clean air is a tough one because the cities are getting more and more dirty with their air, and that's makes it difficult to... if you live in the city, you've got the fumes from the vehicles, and if you live in the country, you've got the fumes from all the poisons that they're putting on the crop. It's kind of hard to figure out where to live. Even in the suburbs, you've got people using glyphosate on their lawns. It's difficult to get away from it all. It's really hard. You have to buy a huge amount of land around you, and then live in the middle of it, and then grow your own crops. Yeah, it's tough to be healthy in the modern world. I think we need a revolution. We definitely need a revolution. And you see so many people getting so sick, it just breaks my heart. All these conditions, obesity I mentioned, and autism, but also diabetes is just a huge epidemic, and Alzheimer's and dementia, all these different issues with neurodegenerative diseases, and just all of them going up dramatically. Cancer, of course, pancreatic cancer, thyroid cancer, liver cancer, and kidney cancer are all going up dramatically in step with the rise in glyphosate usage. It's one of the factors, I think, that's increasing the risk to cancer.
Yes.
And non-Hodgkin's lymphoma.
I've been, since I'm younger, I'm also kind of like looking around at the people my age, and I just see more and more, like, let's call it weakness to generalize, but people are just not as healthy as they used to be.
I agree.
It's a little heartbreaking, and also with the things that I'm like learning for myself, but also then sharing through the podcast, I hope that at least some people can improve their life.
I hope so, yes. And I'd love to see some more people get interested in biology and really dig around the research literature and try to figure out deuterium, because it's really a fun ride, and I think there's a lot more that needs to be understood. I'm partly there, but I'm very excited by how I can start to reframe cancer from the perspective of the deuterium problem. And then, of course, I'm suspecting that that's also the case with Alzheimer's. I'm trying to see how deuterium is impacting Alzheimer's. So I'm trying to figure out how these diseases could be explained through deuterium toxicity, because I think it's pretty major. It's just a hunch that I have that is a pretty major factor in biology that's been overlooked. So I'm especially interested because of the fact that it's not being properly studied. We need to get more people interested in looking into deuterium and the issues around it.
When you figured out the Alzheimer things and deuterium, let me know. Please come back up.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I've been reading a lot about prion diseases, the misfolded proteins. It's so fascinating. The prion protein itself, it's so interesting. And, it plays an important role in the brain and the neurons, actually. It helps the neurons to be protected from reactive oxygen. So it's actually very good as an antioxidant. the prion proteins have antioxidant effects, and they're upregulated when the neuron is exposed to oxidative damage. It starts making more prion protein. So the prion protein actually has an essential role in the neurons to keep them healthy. But if it starts misfolding, all hell breaks loose. First of all, some people are saying that the defect, that the toxicity of the prion protein is not so much about the misfolded form, but the fact that when it misfolds, it gets removed from the cytoplasm and it's a deficiency problem. Some people are saying prion disease is a prion deficiency problem, which is really fascinating. So that's an exciting field where there's been a lot of papers written lately, and a lot of it's speculation because people just cannot figure out what's going on with these proteins. And I suspect deuterium is playing a major role, but I haven't got that worked out yet. So it's just, that's really speculation at this point.
I just had a thought. I don't know, this is like complete speculation on my part. Could it be that the gel in the cell is kind of like loose if it's made with deuterium because the space is different? And that creates a kind of instability, or like, things are not arranged properly. I don't know how to.
Yeah, well, I think that, in fact, the issue, I think, is too little gel. I think that the sulfate makes the gel, and the gel traps the deuterium. And so the deuterium actually concentrates in the gel. And what I'm suspecting is that when that prion protein misfolds, it actually brings deuterium with it. So it builds these, debris, like the Alzheimer's plaque. And that I'm suspecting that debris is high in deuterium. So it's actually pulling deuterium out of the cytoplasm as it misfolds. That's a theory that I'm playing around with. I don't have enough proof yet. I've been reading a lot of papers, but I haven't been able to find anything that actually says that's what's happening. And no one's looking at deuterium. I think no one is looking at deuterium with respect to the prion protein. So I'm kind of lonely in that space. But I would love to encourage someone who knows how to do these kinds of physical experiments, because I'm just totally theoretical. There's someone that could figure out a way to test, for example, just to get some of that plaque and see if it's high deuterium. Seems like it would be possible to do that if you could do that sort of thing.
Yes.
So, it's exciting. I'd love to see more people, and especially researchers, get interested in this space and see if they can start to unravel, some of that. Because I think these protein misfolding diseases are so mysterious. It's just really, really mysterious. And there are many, many proteins that misfold and cause trouble because of it, not just the prion protein. It's sort of the most famous one, but some of the other diseases like ALS and Alzheimer's, actually, those proteins have kind of prion-like properties. And so they're cousins, they're cousins of the prion.
Okay.
And they, too, have very important roles to play in the cell. And lots of times people don't understand what the role is, but, I've looked at a lot of Parkinson's disease as well, and not amyloid beta, but alpha-synuclein is the protein that misfolds in association with Parkinson's disease. And that's also a very interesting protein. So lots to learn there, and lots of mystery. And I always am attracted to something where the puzzle's still out there, like there isn't anyone who knows the answer, So I want to dig into those spaces and try to figure them out. But I don't have the full story on that yet. But I really have a hunch. It's just a hunch that deuterium is playing a major role in these neurodegenerative diseases.
Yes. Well, I think this is a good place to come to a conclusion.
Yes. It's been delightful talking to you. Thank you for allowing me to talk about some of these topics that are sort of obscure, so appreciate that.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's so interesting. And do you want to tell people about your book maybe? And I'm
I'll hold it up again.
Below.
Toxic Legacy.
Yes.
How the weed killer glyphosate is destroying our health and the environment. I'm hoping it'll come out in some other languages. It'd be nice if you could get an Italian version of it, and that may come in time. But so it's available on Amazon. Also, some other booksellers. I have a webpage, StefanieSenff.net, and if you go to StefanieSenff.net/book, you can find out all the booksellers that are selling, that I'm aware of, that are selling my book.
Awesome.
And,
I will.
And I'm on Twitter.
Oh,
I'm back on Twitter. I got thrown off for a while there, but I'm back. So I'm happy about that.
Were you banned?
I was.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Did you get like a warning? Oh, if you behave well and just,
We'll bring you back.
on.
I got a lot of my friends saying, "Oh, I'm back on now." Elon Musk really kind of changed the story, and I was patiently waiting for my turn, and then finally I was back on. Oh, they didn't tell me. It's just like I went to it, and there I was back. So they didn't let me know, but they just put me back on. So that was lovely. So now I'm back on Twitter. And it's more liberal, too, so I'm able to post things that aren't being challenged so far. It's been good, so I appreciate that.
That's good to hear. Are you on any other places online that people can know about?
Well, I am on other more obscure sites. I'm on Facebook, but I don't use Facebook that much.
Oh, okay. Then we'll leave it.
Yeah. And also, I'm on Instagram, but I don't use Instagram either. Pretty much when I post, it goes to Twitter. So.
Okay. I'll put your Twitter link in the description. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure. And I wish you luck in your pursuits, and I hope you can help to get the message out about some of these issues, because I think they're very important. People need to be looking into them more thoroughly.
I think
These research topics, yes.
Yes.